Ever heard of the Black Widows of Liverpool? A tale of two sisters, a string of mysterious deaths, and a town gripped by fear. But who were the real victims in this deadly game? Let's unravel the chilling truth together. Now, as we prepare to dive into our story, make sure you're comfortable. Are you ready? It's story time. Liverpool, 1880. The city was a gritty, busy center of work and trade, where the air was filled with dust and the streets resonated with the sounds of horse-drawn carriages. Amidst this noisy mix of life and work, Thomas, a struggling journalist, sat bent over his desk, his eyes going over the local newspaper for a story that could change his fortunes. Thomas was a man of humble beginnings, a scrappy underdog with a sharp mind and an insatiable curiosity. Journalism was his calling, his ticket out of a life of obscurity. But the big break he yearned for had eluded him so far. He was stuck covering mundane events and petty crimes, his dreams of making a name for himself growing dimmer with each passing day. One gloomy afternoon, as he was sifting through obituaries and classifieds, a particular notice caught his eye. It was an obituary for a certain Mr. Mather, a wealthy merchant who had died suddenly and left behind his grieving sisters, Margaret and Catherine. What piqued Thomas's interest was not the death itself, but the family name, Mather. He had seen it before, in the obituaries, more times than one would expect. Intrigued, Thomas decided to dig a little deeper. He spent the rest of the day buried in the newspaper archives, piecing together a morbid puzzle. Over the past few years, the Mather family had lost not one, not two, but several members under mysterious circumstances. Husbands, children, distant relatives, all had met untimely ends, leaving behind a trail of grief and unanswered questions. As the sun set and the office emptied, Thomas sat alone in the dim light, a growing sense of unease creeping over him. The Mather family wasn't just unfortunate, they were cursed, or so it seemed. But Thomas, with his journalist's instinct, knew better than to believe in curses. There was a story here, a dark and twisted tale that was begging to be told, and he was going to be the one to tell it. With a newfound determination, Thomas packed up his notes and headed home. He had a long night ahead of him. The Mathers had unwittingly become the subject of his next story, and he was going to uncover every secret, every lie that lurked in the shadows of their cursed legacy. Little did he know, his life was about to take a turn as dark and twisted as the tale he was about to unravel. The following day, under a sky as gray as the cobblestone streets, Thomas made his way to the Mather mansion. It was a grand old house that had seen better days, its once vibrant facade now faded and chipped, its gardens overgrown and wild. The mansion stood like a weary sentinel on the edge of the city, its silent windows watching over the bustling streets with an air of melancholy. Thomas knocked on the heavy oak door, his heart pounding in his chest. He was greeted by a gaunt, elderly servant who led him into a dimly lit parlor. The room was filled with antique furniture, their once vibrant colors dulled by time and dust. The air was heavy with the scent of old books and stale air, a testament to the life that once thrived within these walls. It was here that he met the Mather sisters. Margaret, the elder of the two, was a tall, imposing figure with a stern face and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through him. She carried herself with an air of authority, her every word and gesture exuding a cold, calculated control. Catherine, on the other hand, was a stark contrast to her sister. She was petite and meek, her eyes wide and fearful, her voice barely more than a whisper. She clung to her sister's side like a shadow, flinching at every sudden movement. Thomas spent the better part of the afternoon with the sisters, offering his condolences and subtly probing for information. He noticed the tension that hung in the air, the way Catherine would glance nervously at Margaret before speaking, the way the servants would scurry away at the sound of Margaret's voice. It was a house of fear, a house that held its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. As the day wore on, Thomas couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. There was something deeply wrong about the Mather mansion, something that went beyond the string of deaths and the whispers of a curse. He left the mansion with a heavy heart, the image of Catherine's frightened eyes etched into his mind. He knew then that he had stepped into a web of secrets and lies, a web spun by the Black Widows of Liverpool. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself drawn into the world of the Mather sisters. He frequented the local taverns and marketplaces, listening to the whispers of the townsfolk. The Mathers, it seemed, were a family shrouded in mystery and misfortune. Tales of the Mather family curse were passed around like ghost stories, chilling the blood of those who heard them. The more Thomas heard, the more he was convinced that there was more to the story than mere superstition. The townsfolk spoke of the sisters' late husbands, all of whom had been healthy men before they married into the Mather family, only to fall ill and die under mysterious circumstances. They spoke of the children, too, who had been taken by sudden bouts of sickness, their lives snuffed out before they had even begun. Thomas also heard whispers of the sisters' strange behaviors, late-night arguments that echoed through the mansion, the frequent visits from a local doctor, the large quantities of arsenic that Margaret was known to purchase from the apothecary for rat problems. Each piece of the puzzle only served to deepen the mystery, painting a picture of a family plagued by death and deceit. One evening, Thomas managed to corner a former servant of the Mather household in a dingy tavern. The man, half drunk and terrified, spoke of the sisters in hushed tones. He spoke of Margaret's cruel temper, of Catherine's silent tears, of the fear that gripped the household whenever a family member fell ill. By the time the man had finished his tale, Thomas was left with a chilling realization. The Mather family curse was no curse at all. It was something far more sinister, something born of greed and malice. As Thomas delved deeper into the mystery, he found himself walking a dangerous path. But he was a journalist, a seeker of truth, and he would not rest until he had uncovered the dark secret that lay at the heart of the Mather family curse. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas found himself consumed by the Mather mystery. His every waking moment was spent piecing together the morbid puzzle, his nights filled with dreams of death and deceit. The Mather sisters, particularly Catherine, haunted his thoughts. He couldn't shake off the image of her frightened eyes, her trembling hands, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas began to visit the Mather mansion more frequently, each visit revealing another layer of the intricate web of lies and deceit. He watched as Catherine flinched at her sister's voice, as Margaret watched him with a hawk-like intensity, her sharp eyes missing nothing. He saw the fear in the servants' eyes, the way they scurried away at the sound of Margaret's footsteps. His suspicions grew with each visit, each whispered tale, each piece of evidence he unearthed. The Mather family wasn't cursed. They were victims. Victims of a cold, calculated plot that had claimed the lives of innocent people. And at the center of it all were the Mather sisters, one a puppet, the other a puppeteer. The first chapter of his investigation came to a close with a chilling realization. The Mather family curse was no curse at all. It was a carefully orchestrated series of murders, a deadly game played by the Black Widows of Liverpool. And Thomas, with his relentless pursuit of truth, had just become a player in their deadly game. As he left the Mather mansion one cold, dreary evening, he knew that he had crossed a point of no return. He was in too deep, too invested in the mystery to back out now. He had a story to tell, a truth to reveal, and he would stop at nothing to bring the Black Widows of Liverpool to justice. Little did he know, the game was just beginning. The investigation into the Mather sisters took a dark turn as Thomas delved deeper into their affairs. He spent countless hours poring over insurance documents, each one a chilling testament to the sisters' calculated greed. Each policy was taken out shortly before a family member's death, with the sisters named as the sole beneficiaries. It was a pattern too consistent to be mere coincidence. Thomas also discovered the sisters' frequent purchases of arsenic, a potent and deadly poison. The local apothecary, a nervous man with twitchy hands, confirmed that Margaret often bought large quantities of the poison, always with the same excuse, a rat problem. But the Mather mansion, despite its decay, had no signs of a rodent infestation. The arsenic, Thomas realized, was not for rats. His suspicions were further confirmed when he managed to interview the local doctor who frequently visited the Mather mansion. The doctor, a weary man with haunted eyes, spoke of the strange illnesses that plagued the Mather family. Symptoms that didn't align with any known disease, sudden declines in health, and ultimately, death. And always, the presence of Margaret, watching over her ailing family members with an unreadable expression. Each piece of evidence, each whispered confession, painted a grim picture of the Mather sisters. They were not mere beneficiaries of a tragic family curse. They were orchestrators of a deadly plot, a web of deceit spun with threads of greed and malice. And at the center of it all was Margaret, the Black Widow of Liverpool, her sister Catherine trapped in her deadly web. As Thomas pieced together the puzzle, he felt a chill run down his spine. He was dealing with a predator, a woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. But he was not deterred. He was a journalist, a seeker of truth, and he would not rest until he had exposed the deadly secret of the Mather sisters. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas found himself drawn into the world of the Mather sisters. Amidst the grim discoveries and chilling revelations, he found himself increasingly concerned for Catherine. The younger Mather sister was a stark contrast to her cold, calculating sibling. She was a woman of quiet strength, her spirit seemingly unbroken despite the horrors she lived with. Each visit to the Mather mansion brought him closer to Catherine. He saw the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched at her sister's voice, the tremor in her hands as she poured tea. Yet, there was a spark in her, a flicker of defiance that caught Thomas's attention. Catherine was not just a victim, she was a survivor. Slowly, Catherine began to open up to Thomas. Their conversations, initially filled with polite small talk, grew deeper. She spoke of her life before the deaths, of her dreams and hopes that had been crushed under the weight of her sister's ambitions. She spoke of her fear, her guilt, and her desperate desire for freedom. Thomas found himself moved by Catherine's plight. He saw in her a kindred spirit, a fellow prisoner of circumstance. He made a silent vow to help her, to free her from the deadly web her sister had spun. He didn't just want to expose the Black Widows of Liverpool, he wanted to save Catherine from the deadly fate that awaited her. As he left the Mather mansion one evening, he looked back at the imposing structure. In one of the upper windows, he saw Catherine, her face pale against the dark backdrop. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent understanding passing between them. Thomas knew then that he was not just fighting for justice, he was fighting for Catherine's life. As the weeks wore on, Margaret's suspicion of Thomas began to grow. She was no fool. She saw the way Thomas looked at Catherine, the way he asked too many questions, lingered too long. One day, she confronted him in the grand foyer of the Mather mansion, her sharp eyes boring into him. "Mr. Thomas," she began, her voice as cold as the marble floor beneath their feet, "I do appreciate your concern for our family, but I must ask you to respect our privacy." Her words were polite, but the threat beneath them was clear. Thomas met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I mean no disrespect, Miss Mather," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm simply doing my job as a journalist." Margaret's lips curled into a thin smile, but her eyes remained icy. "I suggest you find another story, Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Mather family has suffered enough." With that, she turned on her heel and left, leaving Thomas alone in the echoing foyer. He stood there for a moment, the weight of Margaret's words sinking in. She was warning him, trying to scare him off. But Thomas was not a man to be easily deterred. If anything, Margaret's warning only fueled his determination. He left the Mather mansion that day with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he was walking a dangerous path, but he was not afraid. He had a story to tell, a truth to reveal, and he would not be silenced, Not by Margaret Mather, not by anyone. The Black Widows of Liverpool had spun their web of deceit for far too long. It was time for their deadly secret to be exposed. As Thomas delved deeper into the mystery of the Mather sisters, the danger surrounding his investigation grew. One morning, he found a note slipped under his door. It was a single, chilling sentence written in a hurried scrawl. "Stop digging, or you'll be next." Despite the clear threat, Thomas refused to back down. He had come too far, uncovered too much to give up now. He knew he was walking a dangerous path, but he was not alone. He had Catherine on his side, and together they would bring Margaret's reign of terror to an end. His resolve hardened. Thomas continued his investigation. He spent his days gathering evidence, his nights piecing together the deadly puzzle. With each passing day, the web of deceit spun by the Black Widows of Liverpool began to unravel. As the second chapter of his investigation came to a close, Thomas found himself standing on the precipice of a dangerous truth. He knew the path ahead was fraught with danger, but he was ready. He had a story to tell, a truth to reveal, and he would stop at nothing to bring the Black Widows of Liverpool to justice. One evening, as he sat in his small, dimly lit room, he looked at the pile of evidence he had gathered. Insurance documents, medical records, testimonies from terrified servants. Each piece of evidence was a testament to the sisters' guilt. He knew then that he had enough to expose the sisters, to bring their deadly game to an end. As he looked out of his window at the darkening sky, he made a silent vow. He would not rest until the Mather sisters were brought to justice. He would not let their victims' deaths be in vain. The Black Widows of Liverpool had spun their web of deceit for far too long. It was time for their deadly secret to be exposed, and Thomas would be the one to expose it. The final act of Thomas's investigation began with a flurry of activity. He spent his days in the dusty archives of the local library, his nights in the dimly lit corners of taverns, listening to hushed whispers and gathering the final pieces of the deadly puzzle. He found medical reports that contradicted the supposed natural causes of the family members' deaths. Each report was a chilling testament to the sisters' guilt, a silent accusation from beyond the grave. He also found proof of Margaret's manipulation of Catherine, letters filled with veiled threats and cruel taunts that revealed the true nature of their relationship. The final piece of the puzzle came from the most unlikely source, the local apothecary. A nervous man with twitchy hands, he confessed to Thomas about the unusual amounts of arsenic Margaret purchased. He spoke of his fear, his guilt, and his relief at finally revealing the truth. With the final pieces in place, Thomas knew he had enough to expose the Mather sisters. He had a story to tell, a truth to reveal, and he would stop at nothing to bring the Black Widows of Liverpool to justice. As he sat in his small, dimly lit room, he looked at the pile of evidence he had gathered. Each piece of evidence was a testament to the sisters' guilt, a silent accusation from the victims they had claimed. He knew then that he had enough to expose the sisters, to bring their deadly game to an end. With a renewed sense of purpose, Thomas prepared for the final act of his investigation. He knew the path ahead was fraught with danger, but he was ready. He had a story to tell, a truth to reveal, and he would not rest until the Black Widows of Liverpool were brought to justice. With the evidence in hand, Thomas made his way to the Mather mansion. His heart pounded in his chest as he knocked on the heavy oak door. He was greeted by the same gaunt servant who led him into the parlor where the Mather sisters awaited. Margaret sat in her usual spot, her sharp eyes watching him with an unreadable expression. Catherine was a shadow at her side, her eyes wide and fearful. Thomas took a deep breath and laid out the evidence before them. The room fell into a tense silence as Margaret scanned the documents, her face pale but composed. Catherine, on the other hand, looked like a deer caught in the headlights, her eyes darting between Thomas and her sister. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was as cold as ice. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Mr. Thomas," she said. her gaze never leaving his. Before Thomas could respond, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. His vision blurred, his knees buckled. He looked down to see a small dart protruding from his chest. He looked up in time to see Margaret standing over him, a cruel smile on her face. "You should have left well enough alone, Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice echoing in his ears as darkness closed in. Despite the poison coursing through his veins, Thomas managed to stumble out of the mansion. He staggered through the streets of Liverpool, his vision fading, his strength waning. But he had one last task to complete. He had to reach the constable, had to reveal the truth before it was too late. With the last of his strength, he pushed on, his determination the only thing keeping him upright. Barely conscious and on the brink of death, Thomas stumbled into the constable's office. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping out his accusation against the Mather sisters. The constable, a gruff man with a heart of gold, immediately sent for a doctor and rallied a group of brave townsfolk to storm the Mather mansion. The mansion, once a symbol of grandeur and wealth, now stood as a monument to deceit and death. The constable and his men found Catherine alone in the mansion, shaking and terrified. Margaret was nowhere to be found. She had fled, leaving her sister to face the consequences alone. Catherine, faced with the undeniable evidence and the absence of her sister, confessed to their crimes. She revealed that it was Margaret who masterminded the murders, using her as a pawn in her deadly game. The confession sent shockwaves through the town, the reality of the Mather sisters' crimes hitting the townsfolk like a punch to the gut. As the news of the Black Widows of Liverpool spread, a manhunt for Margaret was launched. But it was like searching for a ghost. Margaret had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of death and a town reeling from her betrayal. Meanwhile, Thomas, having survived his brush with death, lay in a small, dingy room, his body racked with pain, but his spirit unbroken. He had exposed the Black Widows of Liverpool, but his job was not done. Margaret was still out there, and he vowed to bring her to justice, no matter what it took. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Liverpool was a town transformed. The Mather mansion stood empty, a grim reminder of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. Catherine was behind bars, her confession sending shockwaves through the town. Margaret was a ghost, her whereabouts unknown, her legacy a chilling tale of death and deceit. Thomas, having survived his brush with death, wrote an exposé that shook Liverpool to its core. The tale of the Black Widows of Liverpool was laid bare for all to see, the truth as chilling as the winter wind. The town mourned for the victims, their deaths no longer a mystery, but a grim testament to the sisters' greed. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas found himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see Margaret's cold, calculating eyes watching him. But she was gone, vanished like a ghost in the night. The Black Widow of Liverpool had spun her last web, her reign of terror brought to an end by a journalist's relentless pursuit of truth. The story ends with a chilling twist. One day, a letter arrived for Thomas, postmarked from America. The handwriting was familiar, the message a chilling reminder of the past. It was from Margaret, warning him that she was starting a new life across the pond. She warned him to stop digging into the past, to let sleeping dogs lie. But Thomas was not a man to be easily deterred. He knew that the Black Widow of Liverpool was still out there, her deadly game far from over. And as long as she was out there, he would continue his pursuit of truth. For the victims, for Catherine, for justice. As he looked out of his window at the bustling streets of Liverpool, he made a silent vow. He would not rest until Margaret was brought to justice. The Black Widows of Liverpool may have spun their last web in this town, but their story was far from over. And Thomas would be there, ready to expose their deadly secrets, no matter where they tried to hide. As our story comes to a close, let the lull of this soothing ambiance continue to cradle you further into your journey of calmness and rest. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your relaxation and sleep routine tonight. Remember, Each day brings a new story, and each night brings a fresh chance to regenerate, to dream, and to become more of who you are. As this background sound lulls you further into sleep, I hope you find peace, comfort, and a well-deserved rest. Good night, dear listener. Until our next story, sleep well and dream beautifully.